class, welcome back to Strategies of Missions and Leadership Development. Last time we looked at our early Reformation missional strategy. We looked at Martin Luther, looked at John Calvin, looked at some other events there. And then today we are going to continue our look with the history of missional strategies, and we're going to be looking at colonial missions. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're now going to move into the Strategies of Missions Leadership Development PowerPoint on colonial missions strategy. So last time we looked at the Protestant Reformation and that there was not a major arm for missional strategy from the actual Protestants of the Reformation. But now we're going to move and shift in time to the 17th and 18th century. So you see there on the screen, the introduction, you see our time period. And this is going to be post-Reformation. So now we move past the Reformation, and we're going to be looking at Catholic and Protestant missions because they're split. You have Catholic and you have Protestant missions. Of course, I'm going to be focused more on the Protestant side, but I just want you to know that there are Catholic and Protestant missions. There's expansion going on. As these European nations begin to spread around and establish colonies around the world, so did the church. The church also spread, and missional work was being done. So just briefly, we'll talk about some Catholic missionaries. As part of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church renewed their missionary efforts in Europe. And so the Counter-Reformation is after the Catholic Church saw that the Protestant Reformation was a snowball going down a hill that they could not stop. They realized they were not going to be putting the cat back in the bag on this. And so they realize, you know what, we need to start shaping up. We need to start getting our doctrine down. We need to start getting the way we do things, start cleaning up the church, make sure the priests are following rules that they're supposed to follow, and ensure that the sacraments are established. And they did a lot of things to kind of clean up the Catholic Church, if you will. But one thing that they definitely focused on was their missionary efforts in Europe, but also they had a heavy focus on the New World. Once Christopher Columbus founded the New World, then it was not long that Spain and Portugal, and there's going to be others coming, that the missionaries began to follow the explorers. Well, there are Catholic monastic orders, mainly the Jesuits. I'm sure you've heard of them. Again, we're not going to go into any great detail on these, but there were monastic orders that would train indigenous converts, but there always remained a strong paternalism with the Catholic Church in Rome. So the idea was that a missionary would go and to a monastery or some sort of a mission that was set up in the New World, let's say. They would go and evangelize the indigenous people, and then the indigenous people would become converts. Now, of course, this is converts to Catholicism, but the idea was then these indigenous peoples would be trained to be kind of like religious leaders, and they would be able to start indigenous churches. That was kind of the idea. But there remained a very strong paternalism with the Catholic Church back in Rome, which that never left. And so what happened was you have basically European monks and priests in the New World or wherever the exploration has taken the missionary, and they're trying to basically make them subjects to the Catholic Church just like they would be in Europe. So it never worked out that the indigenous people kind of took control of the ministry there, and there was it kind of like an indigenous Catholic Church. It was always back to Rome. Also, as Spain and Portugal's power waned, so did missions. And that's what happened. Spain and Portugal's power does wane, especially with control of the seas. Once the Spanish Armada was defeated, then the powerhouse on the oceans becomes Great Britain. So as that waned, so did missions. That also suffered because of the nation that was in charge back in Europe was having difficulties. But like I said, we're going to focus here a little bit more on Protestant missionaries, and I'm just going to point out just a few things. And I want to talk about Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf. You see his dates there, 1700 to 1760. And he was a very important aristocrat he's a Christian, and he sets up a community of pietistic people. So these are those that are following pietism, a very a humble and focused life on how you live and a life of prayer. And he sets up a community in Moravia, which is in today's Herrnhut, Germany. The actual community was called Herrnhut, and it still exists today. I have a picture coming up. But Zinzendorf, he has this major focus on missions. And the Herrnhut community becomes a force for early missions. And so being sent out of Moravia are missionaries, and they go all over the world. They go to the Virgin Islands, they go to Greenland, they go to the Gold Coast in Africa, they go to South Africa, they go to the Caribbean, they land in Jamaica, and then also to the American Indians in Georgia, in the early societies that were in Georgia. And so you see this kind of force shooting out of Germany, and they're all with this focus of taking the gospel to the lost. There's a picture of Zinzendorf there on the left, and Herrnhut, Germany today there on the right. So this is still there today. The actual community has obviously grown up into a town today, but it was just this area in Germany became a great force for missional activity. So what was Zinzendorf's strategy? So there's a couple of things here on the screen that we'll talk about. Again, number one, kind of just like the Protestant Reformation, number one, preaching was the avenue to take Christ out to the people, and it always focused on Jesus Christ. Number two was learning the culture of the people group. And so they were culturally sensitive. They didn't come in and say, like, we're from Europe and do it our way. That's actually going to come later. That's going to happen, but the missionaries that Zinzendorf sent out, they would go into a culture and learn the culture, learn the people group, learn what they did, and then adapt to those people. They would not adapt the gospel. The gospel wouldn't change, but they would adapt to the culture to be able to reach the people the best way possible. Number three was translation work. That starts to happen here. It's obviously going to happen later on with some of the 19th century missionaries getting the Bible translated into the language of the people. You can start thinking of like William Carey in India translating the Bible there. Number four, self-support once on location. Now, Zinzendorf was a wealthy individual. He was of the aristocracy, and he would pay for the missionaries to go to the field. So the actual travel expense on the ship or whatever he would pay for. But once they entered into the people group that they were ministering to, the missionaries would then become self-supporting, almost like a tent maker. How Paul was a tent maker, and he would kind of support himself that way. There would be self-support once on the location. And then number five, social programs began popping up. This is a focus on the sick and widows, orphans, and poor. And so when you're ministering to people, especially those that are suffering in society, you're able to proclaim the gospel easier, or might have more fruit that way, because people in desperate need the answers, and the answer is Jesus. And so the sick, the widows, orphans, poor were definitely a focus for these missionaries. And then number six, kind of going on with number four, self-support once on location. So you're going to be in the community and working in the community. You have relational evangelism going on there, number six, where the people worked and lived alongside those that evangelized. They were right there, having relationships with them, working next to them, living next door to them, or whatever it may be, but they were able to foster a relationship that they could then evangelize those people. So this was a strategy that Zinzendorf had for the missionaries that were sent out of Herrnhut, Germany. Okay, so let's continue on here, and we're going to be looking at the First Great Awakening in the Americas. And this is 1730 to 1755 is the First Great Awakening. And the reason that this is going to be looked at under missions is that the First Great Awakening actually began in Great Britain and then came across the ocean. So there is an evangelistic movement, a missional kind of movement here. But the First Great Awakening, what was it? It was an influential evangelical movement in the modern period. It pretty much starts the modern period of missions. that occurred in Great Britain and then in America. And this occurs the first half of the 18th century, as you can see there on the dates on the screen. And it's called the First Great Awakening. Later on, it was also known as an evangelical revival and the Wesleyan revival, because you really don't call something First Great Awakening until there's going to be a second, so which there will be a second. Now, the Second Great Awakening, when I talk about that, is not so much in regards to a mission strategy or a mission movement. It's more of just a revival movement, because really it just kind of spreads around in the United States. But the First Great Awakening was in Great Britain and crossed over the ocean to America. So let's look at the background of it. Number one, it was a movement of God during a low morale and a religious ebb. It was kind of a down low time in society. There were a lot of moral issues going on, and people were just kind of doing religion like just out of habit almost, just something that they did. And so it was kind of a lower time. Number two, English Christians were influenced by skeptics, rationalists, and deists. And so you're having, during the Enlightenment time period, and people begin to become skeptical, or not really believing in Jesus. They believe there's a God out there, like a deist believes that there's a God, but not necessarily Jesus Christ. And so there was Christianity was being influenced by these things. Like I said, there was moral life that was low in England. Number four, low religious enthusiasm by monarchs caused people not to care about religion. And that's one thing that kind of comes out of the Reformation, is that in the Middle Ages, the churches and the people in charge, like the civil authorities, like the kings or whatever, they would be intertwined almost. And the monarchs would be very interested in religion, what their religion was. It was kind of like the religion of the land. They definitely has a little more enthusiasm back then. But now, after the Reformation has kind of settled down and they've moved on, religious enthusiasm by kings, it just kind of waned, and the people weren't even all that interested in religion anymore. I mean, of course, it was still there, and there were still churches, and people were not overly religious, if you will. And then number five, industrialization caused wide class separation. And so you have the lower classes beginning to pop up, where the lower classes did all the work, and the upper class were enjoying the fruits of the lower classes' labor. And so there was a wide class separation. And the Great Awakening kind of just cut right through that. So this is just background information about why the Great Awakening occurs. You see some big names here in church history, obviously, but also in missions. We see George Whitefield, we see John and Charles Wesley, we see Jonathan Edwards. These are big names. And in the First Great Awakening, they were big names in regards to missions, because they were the ones that were going around and proclaiming the gospel in Great Britain and in the Americas. And so you see there on the screen, George Whitefield, he was a great preacher in Great Britain and America. John and Charles Wesley, they actually began as missionaries for the Anglican Church in Georgia to the indigenous people, to the Native Americans in Georgia. And so this is going to be what Georgia becomes today, the state of Georgia. It was first a colony, and before that, it was just a land where there were Native Americans, and John and Charles Wesley went there to evangelize them. However, they were not believers in Christ yet. They went there under the umbrella of the Anglican Church, but they themselves had never been converted, and they returned to England and get saved then, and then become even more involved in the First Great Awakening, and they actually begin the Methodist movement. And then Jonathan Edwards, he was in America, and his most famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," where he just preached that sermon, and people just came to God and just repenting because of how terrifying it would be to be, as it says, a sinner in the hand of an angry God. So Jonathan Edwards, a great preacher. Here's their pictures. You can see them, just some well-known paintings. Probably the most well-known of any kind of artwork that if you talk about these guys, this is what you would think of. Whitefield on the left, John and Charles Wesley in the center, and then Jonathan Edwards on the right. Okay, let's look at John and Charles Wesley quick. You see their dates, 1703 to 1791 for John, and Charles is 1707 to 1788. Like I said, they were missionaries to the Native Americans in Georgia for the Church of England, or what we would say is the Anglican Church. And they returned to England, and in 1738, that's when they professed personal faith in Jesus when they returned from being missionaries. And then what happened is they joined up with George Whitefield, and they basically all three came together. John Wesley founded Methodism, and all three of them basically formed as kind of like a Methodist movement. So they become the leaders in it, the leadership of the Methodist movement. And so Whitefield, he was basically the preacher. Charles Wesley was the songwriter, and he wrote many songs. John Wesley was also a preacher, but he was the one that really sustained the movement. And so all three of these guys worked together and proclaimed Jesus where they were ministering. They went around Britain, they went around Wales and Scotland holding revivals. They formed the Methodist societies, and you may have heard it, circuit preachers. They formed that. That was definitely a Methodist type of activity where they could proclaim the gospel by going from one town to another to another to another on circuits, and they would preach in these different towns. And so it was very effective, and they would be spreading the word of God that way. However, they ended up splitting up over a theological issue because the Wesleys were Arminian and Whitefield was Calvinistic, and so they couldn't really get along theologically, and so they ended up splitting. And that's when Whitefield goes to America. So in America, Methodist preachers had already gone to America. They were already there kind of going around. But when the colonies separated from England, i.e. the Revolutionary War, the Methodists also separated, and they created the Methodist Episcopal Church in America, had gone to America, and he became one of the greatest revival preachers in America, and he met up with Jonathan Edwards, and they worked together to continue to spread the gospel. So let's look at Jonathan Edwards real quick, 1703 to 1757. He was a Congregationalist in Northampton, Massachusetts, and educated at Yale, which Yale today is a far cry from what it was because they basically were founded as a school of theology, and now today it's just a complete liberal school. Has absolutely nothing to do with religion or theology. But he had a great revival from his preaching, especially, like I said, the most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And what he did was he preached to people's emotions for a response. But he ensured that when he preached that the emotions did not eclipse the conversion. The people were putting their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. They weren't putting their faith and trust in some sort of emotional response. If a preacher preaches fire and brimstone kind of messages, and that the people get so emotional that they put their faith and trust in a salvation based on emotions. So Jonathan Edwards really did a good job in making sure that he preached to people's emotions for a response to Christ, and people turning to Christ, not that the conversion is eclipsed by the emotional response. This is Jonathan Edwards Church today. You can see it there in Northampton, Massachusetts. This is rebuilt because the original one burned down, but this is the only original feature is the actual front steps, which were stone, and that survived the fire. And so the front steps are still there, and that was original. I've been in this church. I stood right there on those front steps where this arrow is pointing. And I have a picture. It's kind of not a very good picture of inside the church, but it's not that great of a picture, so I didn't put it on here. But this is the church of Jonathan Edwards. Okay, so let's continue on and look at the results of the First Great Awakening in the Americas. New leaders in the Church of England became evangelical because of this. One of them is William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833. You know him very well. He was most well known because he led the anti-slavery movement. And that anti-slave movement had a great impact on how nations controlled their colonies and how the gospel could continue to go out and be proclaimed to the indigenous people that the European nation now controlled as a colony. Number two, was the start of a missions movement. Of course, this really catches on for a good number of years, and missionaries are going out. Number 3, the Bible and tract publications begin to really start gaining momentum. Bibles are being printed, tracts are being printed in the language of the people, and publications are going out and being spread around. And then, like I said, one of the results was the establishment of the Methodists. Number 5, numerous conversions of people. People had a focus on personal conversion of the lost. 6, other evangelicals, such as the Baptists, benefited from the Great Awakening. If conversion was based on a personal experience, many Congregationalists who believed in infant baptism, they saw that as an issue. An infant can't have a personal experience of salvation. And so they were basically saying, we can't follow this Congregationalist belief, and they broke off and they became Baptists. Other groups did benefit from the First Great Awakening. And then number 7, spiritual unity in the colonies. Because the mission movement that occurred, it began to really spread around the colonies, and there was like a spiritual unity. There was almost this idea of that this is a Christian locale in the world. The movement that takes place in Europe moves across the ocean, and it occurs in the colonies of the New World and kind of unites them. Okay, so that is it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. All right, class, that's it for today. Next time, we're going to be looking at the very busy 19th century missional strategy. I'll see you then.